Ich habe hier ein Buch, das heißt Power Systems, Noam Chomsky, eines der letzten Publikationen, und da steht drauf, sein Number One, Public Intellectual. Hinter steht, the world's greatest public intellectual, the intellectual superstar. Oder er wird auch zitiert in dem Lexikon Arts and Humanities Citation Index, er sei die am häufigsten zitierte lebende Person der Welt. Er ist auch Mitglied der Industrial Workers of the World und der Internationalen Organisation für eine partizipatorische Gesellschaft. Wie kommt es, dass Noam Chomsky so ein globales Phänomen ist, der berühmteste Intellektuelle der Welt? Die New York Times Book Review hat ihn genannt, der wichtigste Intellektuelle der Gegenwart. Aber Noam sagt dazu aus seiner ganz leise Art, Zitat, das sollte man sehr genau lesen. Wenn man nämlich das Original nachschaut, dann heißt es weiter in der New York Times, wenn dies der Fall ist, dass Noam Chomsky der wichtigste Intellektuelle der Welt ist, wie kann er dann solchen Unsinn über die amerikanische Außenpolitik schreiben? Diesen Zusatz zitiert man nie, aber um ehrlich zu sein, gäbe es diesen Zusatz nicht, würde ich glauben, ich mache etwas falsch. Wie kam es, ganz kurz, dass Noam Chomsky diese globale Bedeutung hat als Archetypus des öffentlichen Intellektuellen? Ich würde sagen, weil er 4 Revolutionen mitgemacht hat. Die erste war die berühmte Revolution der Linguistik, der Sprachphilosophie. Die zweite war die nächste Revolution einer neuen Theorie des Geistes. Dann die dritte Revolution war er als Medientheoretiker, nämlich die Manufacturing Consent, die Massenmedien zu sehen als eine Fabrik, die im Auftrag der Elite die Massen dazu zwingt, in Konsens mit der Elite zu geraten. Das Buch heißt zum Beispiel Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies, Gedankenkontrolle in demokratischen Staaten. Und schließlich wurde er als 4. Revolutionär zu einem politischen Philosophen mit Werken wie American Power and the New Mandarins, The Political Economics of Human Rights und Power and Ideology, und er hat mit seinem Werk Profit over People, Profit über Leuten, hat in der Tat die entscheidende Maxime zum Verständnis für den gegenwärtigen Zustand unserer Gesellschaft geliefert, wo tatsächlich die Regel gilt, Profit ist wichtiger als die Leute. Und er hat auch das Buch gemacht, War Against the People, Menschenrechte und Schurkenstaaten, die Zukunft des Staates vom klassischen Liberalismus zum libertären Sozialismus. Diese beiden letzten Titel zeigen, worum es Chomsky im Wesentlichen geht. Sie müssen wissen, alle Philosophen, Politphilosophen der Neuzeit waren im Grunde Staatsphilosophen. Angefangen von Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, 1651, da wurde gesagt, der Staat muss sich gründen auf Angst, steht wortwörtlich dort. Wir müssen den Bürger Angst einflößen, dann wird er uns gehorchen. Das heißt, und dieses Staatsmonster hat er den Namen gegeben, Leviathan. Ob das Hegel war, Grundlinien der Philosophie des Rechts, oder der berüchtigte Karl Schmitt über Schuld und Schuldaten, alle Politphilosophen waren Staatsphilosophen. Er ist der Erste, der gesagt hat, nein, wir müssen davon ausgehen, dass es nicht um den Staat geht, sondern um den Bürger, um die Freiheit des Individuums. Und Sie werden nicht glauben, wer sein Vorläufer ist. Er zitiert dann das öfter, er beruft sich hin. Der Vorläufer ist der Deutsche, und zwar Wilhelm von Humboldt, dem wir die Humboldt-Universität in Berlin verdanken. Wilhelm von Humboldt hat das Werk geschrieben, Ideen, und zwar 1792. Das ist eine Quelle, die er selbst zitiert, Noam Chomsky. Das Werk heißt Ideen zu einem Versuch, die Grenzen der Wirksamkeit des Staates zu bestimmen. Und er geht davon aus, ich zitiere Humboldt, der wahre Zweck des Menschen ist die Bildung seiner Kräfte zu einem Ganzen. Zu dieser Bildung ist Freiheit die erste unerlässliche Bedienung. Sonst werden aus Menschen Maschinen gemacht. Darauf sozusagen, diesen Anspruch sozusagen, folgt Noam Chomsky in seiner politischen Philosophie. Man könnte also sagen, er war immer Cartesianer. Als Linguist, als Medientheoretiker, als Cartesianer, also kommen von Descartes, sind sie Rationalist, mit klaren Entscheidungen, aufgebaut auf Fakten und auf Zahlen. Und das macht seine Schriften so wesentlich aus. Er ist kein politischer Philosoph, der die Ideologien erklärt, sondern seine Analysen sind immer faktisch und auf Zahlen aufgebaut. Insofern könnten wir seine Tätigkeit als politischer Philosoph mit Kant paraphrasieren. Was er macht, ist Kritik der politischen Vernunft oder und mit unserem Hausautor Peter Sloterdijk könnten wir sagen, er macht eine Kritik der zynischen Politik. Wenn ich das alles zusammenfasse, was Chomsky als einzigartiger Universalgelehrter gemacht hat, ja, von der Sprachphilosophie zur britischen Philosophie, immer im Namen eines advokatorischen Humanismus, immer kämpfen für die Freiheit des Individuums, immer für die Autonomie des Bürgers. Und wenn ich Zeit hätte, ja, und die Zeit hätte ich nur, wenn ich das Z-Camp nicht leiten würde, ja, würde ich gerne eine Biografie schreiben und der Titel dieser Biografie wäre Citizen of the Century. Bon, you as a citizen. My name, citizen of the century.
Thank you. The topic that was announced is a large one. I can't review it in great detail, but I'll try to give some indication of how I think it can be productively explored. The issues are general, but I'll keep to the United States for several reasons. One reason is that it's obviously the most important case in the contemporary world. A second reason is that it's an unusually open society, uniquely so, I believe, and so we have a great deal of evidence about the internal forces that drive planning, much more so than anywhere else that I know of. And thirdly, it's simply the most important case for us, for American citizens. That's perfectly obvious, but it's plainly true for Europeans as well. More than any other area, the United States is influenced considerably by Europe's stance. Actually, we saw a graphic indication of that pretty recently when Obama backed away from his plan to bomb Syria on rather questionable assumptions after the British Parliament withdrew the usual British support for U.S. violence. So with this in mind, let's ask what are the driving forces of policy in the United States? In fact, again, in any global actor, but the U.S. is the most important of these by a large margin. There is a received version. It's common to academic scholarship, public discourse, diplomatic usage. So I'll just quote a few leading figures to illustrate, but it's quite general. So it takes a George Kennan, one of the people who shaped the modern world. According to him, government is created to assure order and justice internally and to provide for the common defense. Take a leading realist scholar, John Mearsheimer. The structure of the international system forces countries concerned about their security to compete with each other for power. Pick a leading scholar of U.S. Middle East policy, William Quandt, also has long diplomatic experience. He writes that the driving force of U.S. policy is to ensure security and well-being of the population. And all, therefore, agree that the primary concern since 1945, some say since 1917, has been the Russian threat. There are a number of ways to evaluate the doctrine. Let's start with the Russian threat and return to the search for security. One obvious question to ask is what happened when the Russian threat disappeared in 1989, a very clear test of the universal agreement. The answer is everything continued as before, completely inconsistent with the standard doctrine. So a couple of weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States invaded Panama. bombarded slums, killed probably thousands of people, poor people. We don't count our own crimes, so that's an estimate. Stalled a client regime, completely routine practice in US domains, but not quite routine. There was one difference. For the first time, it was not justified by an alleged Russian threat. Rather, there was a series of fraudulent pretexts concocted that collapse instantly on examination. As usual, the media chimed in enthusiastically, lauded the heroic achievement of defeating Panama. Totally unconcerned with the fact that the pretexts were ludicrous. It was a radical violation of international law. Also overlooking the fact that it was very harshly condemned elsewhere, most dramatically in Latin America. Also ignored was the US veto of a unanimous Security Council resolution condemning US crimes carried out by troops during the invasion. Britain abstained politely. All completely routine, all completely forgotten in the United States and probably Europe, though not in Panama, not surprisingly, which is also routine. Well, with the Russians gone, the government, that was the first Bush administration, quickly issued a new national security policy and a new military budget. Same as before, but with new pretexts. So we need a huge military establishment, not to defend ourselves against the Russians, but because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. Well-trained intellectuals are not supposed to laugh when they hear that, and they didn't. It's necessary to maintain what they called the defense industrial base. That's a euphemism for high-tech industry, which is based on extensive state intervention in the economy in what's called our free market economy. Most interesting was the Middle East. The new strategy said we have to maintain intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, and then followed an interesting phrase where the serious threats to our interests could not have been laid at the Kremlin's door. So, sorry, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but can't do it anymore. So we now have to concede that the main concern was always, and now explicitly stated, what's called radical nationalism, meaning independent nationalism. All of this passed without any comment, but it has quite evident bearing on the standard doctrine. There were other important events that took place immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, ending the Cold War. One of them was in El Salvador. That was the leading recipient of US military aid. It's apart from Israel and Egypt, a separate category. Also had one of the worst human rights records in the world. That's a familiar correlation. Immediately after the Berlin Wall fell, the Salvadoran High Command, which is in close contact to the US Embassy, ordered the Atlacatl Brigade to invade the university, Jesuit university, and to murder 6 leading intellectuals, 6 leading Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, also to murder anybody else who might be around so there wouldn't be any witnesses, so their housekeeper and her daughter had their heads blown off too. The brigade had just returned from advanced training at the John F. Kennedy School of Special Warfare in North Carolina, and already had left a bloody trail of thousands of the usual victims in the course of the US-run state terror campaign in El Salvador, one part of a much broader torture terror campaign throughout the region. All completely routine, little interest, very little comment, all forgotten. here too, I presume, we can just imagine what had happened, what would have happened if anything remotely similar would have taken place, say, in Czechoslovakia under Russian rule. Now, that tells us quite a lot about the factors that drive policy, and if we're honest, it tells us a lot about ourselves as well. Another illustrative example is Cuba. Cuba gained independence in 1959, and for 40 years, this is 1989, the United States had subjected it to a murderous terrorist attack. It was particularly extreme during the Kennedy years, and of course, a crushing embargo. The pretext was the Russian threat. 1989, no more Russian threat. So what happened? The attack on Cuba became harsher. It was spearheaded by liberal Democrats. In the next election, 1992, Clinton outflanked Bush from the right on Cuba. That's Cuba. Actually, none of this would have come as a surprise to people who paid any attention to the declassified record of internal planning documents. From the Kennedy years, the early 60s, they made it clear that the threat of Cuba was what the government called successful defiance of US policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. The doctrine declared US intention to dominate the hemisphere, and the Cubans were defying it, and worse, defying it successfully. So no Russians, but the US intention to dominate the hemisphere. All of this passed without any impact on the Standard Doctrine. Actually, another important event took place right away in Europe. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to allow unification of Germany and its membership in NATO, a hostile military alliance. In the light of the history of the century, that was a pretty astonishing concession. Don't have to comment on it. But there was a quid pro quo. The US President, President Bush, his Secretary of State, James Baker, agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the official phrase. That was referring to East Germany. Instantly, they expanded NATO to East Germany. Gorbachev was naturally outraged, but when he complained, he was instructed by Washington that this was only a verbal promise. It was a gentleman's agreement, and if he's stupid enough to accept a gentleman's agreement from the United States, it's his problem. So it's without force. All routine, as was the silent acceptance and approval in the United States and, in fact, in Europe. Clinton then came into office. He expanded NATO further, right along the Russian border. Today, the world faces quite a serious crisis that is in no small measure a result of these policies, all passing without comment. Well, there's a great deal more that took place after the Cold War ended. I think it's highly revealing, but instead of proceeding with that, let's turn to a couple of other ways to evaluate the Standard Doctrine. One source of information, which is particularly valuable in the United States because it is such an open society, is secret documents that have been released, made public, declassified. They give very revealing accounts of the actual motives of state policy. That's why they're always consistently ignored. There's no time to review the matter here, but it's worth mentioning some persistent themes. One of them, a major one, we find consistently is that a major force driving policy is concern about what Henry Kissinger called viruses that spread contagion. That's dangerous. Kissinger was referring specifically to Allende's Chile, which threatened to spread the contagion of a peaceful parliamentary path towards independent development and social welfare. We know the outcome in that case. And it's duplicated in case after case throughout Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, always with the same reasoning. Can't tolerate viruses. If you have a virus that might spread contagion, the proper reaction is to kill the virus and protect those who might be infected from contagion. That means destroy the country or its government, kill huge numbers of people, and install harsh, brutal military dictatorships all around the region. That's the main pattern of the Cold War after 1945. Well, a lot more to say about that, but I think that the historical record demonstrates quite clearly that the standard doctrine has little merit. And in fact, security in the normal sense is not a prominent factor in state policy, to repeat, in the normal sense. But in evaluating the standard doctrine about security, there's some questions that we have to ask that are rarely raised. Security for whom? And security from what malevolent forces? Well, one answer is security for state power. There are many illustrations of that. Let me take an interesting current one, last couple of weeks. A couple of weeks ago, the United States agreed to support a UN Security Council resolution which called on the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes in Syria. But the U.S. added a proviso: there cannot be any inquiry into possible war crimes by Israel or by the United States. That's outlawed, as they made clear. Actually, with regard to the United States, it's redundant. The United States has explicit legislation granting the president the right to use force to rescue, it's the term that's used, any American who might be brought to The Hague for trial, sometimes called the Netherlands Invasion Act. But it's much more general. The United States is, of course, uniquely self-immunized from the international legal system. That's a prerogative of the most powerful state. It's quite an interesting topic, no time to pursue, but it illustrates the importance of protecting the security of state power. Well, who are the dread enemies from whom the security of state power must be protected? One prominent enemy is the domestic population. It's always been understood to be a threatening enemy. The leading public intellectual of the 20th century in the United States, Walter Lippmann, Wilson, Roosevelt, liberal, political analyst, progressive democratic theorist, he explained that policymakers, I'm quoting him, and the responsible intellectuals who cooperate with them must be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, that's the public, who are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who have to be put in their place. That's liberal democratic theory, and liberal intellectuals quite generally have agreed in similar terms. Well, to achieve that end, to put the meddlesome outsiders in their place, one essential device, of course, is secrecy. You take a look at government secrecy, run through internal documents, it rarely, very rarely, has a genuine security motivation, but it definitely does serve to keep the population in the dark. In sharp contrast to that, the population cannot be secure from state power. There's an obvious, striking current illustration of that, the NSA revelations of Edward Snowden, which are a radical attack on the U.S. Constitution by the constitutional lawyer in the White House, released, as you know, by the courageous fighter for freedom, Edward Snowden, expertly summarized, analyzed in a recent book by his collaborator, Glenn Greenwald, very much worth reading. The documents, as you know, reveal an assault on basic rights of quite astonishing scale. They're designed to retrieve every possible bit of information about every person who falls within the grasp of the colossus. And that means, in principle, every person linked in any way to the modern electronic society, computer, phone, including phones that are turned off or in any other way. Nothing anywhere near so ambitious was ever envisioned by George Orwell or other dystopian prophets of grim totalitarian worlds ahead. And it's of no slight significance that the project is being conducted with enthusiasm and fervor in one of the freest countries in the world. And it is indeed in quite explicit violation of the US Constitution, the founding document of American freedom. Take a look at the Bill of Rights. It protects citizens from unreasonable search and seizure. It ensures the privacy of their persons, homes, papers, and effects. And much as government lawyers may try, there's no way to reconcile these principles with the assault on the population that's revealed in the Snowden documents. It's also well to remember that defense of these fundamental rights, the rights of privacy, were a major factor in sparking the American Revolution. At that time, the tyrant was the British government, which claimed the right to intrude freely into personal life. Now the tyrant is the American government. Britain hasn't changed. It's retained its traditional tyrannical principles, though on a much more restricted scale, given the relations of power. So the British government approached Washington, the U.S., asking that the U.S. National Security Agency, I'll quote, analyze and retain any British citizens' mobile phones and fax numbers, emails, and IP addresses, anything that's swept up in the dragnet, which picks up essentially everything. It's also worthwhile for Europeans and others to know that the NSA routinely receives or intercepts routers, servers, other computer network devices that are being exported from the United States so that it can implant surveillance tools, and in principle, every keystroke that can be sent to President Obama's huge, expanding database in Utah. And presumably, China does the same, at least tries to. All of this is justified by security, but it's important to bear in mind that when a state pleads security, that should be disregarded. It carries no information, literally. The plea is completely predictable, whatever the facts, so it's uninformative. That's true of all states when they're caught in some crime or other malfeasance. And indeed, it was true in this case. As soon as the Snowden documents were released, the president and top officials stated that the NSA dragnet had stopped 54 terrorist acts. It's pretty serious. On inquiry, it was reduced to a dozen terrorist acts. Then the congressional legislation set up a high-level inquiry, access to top-level documents and so on, and it found one case. One person had sent $8,500 to Somalia. That's the total yield of this massive system in protecting our security. Again, completely routine. There's another concern, the security from private power, for private power. And there's some interesting current illustrations of that, which Europe is involved in. There are huge trade agreements being negotiated, trans-Pacific and transatlantic. They're called free trade agreements, but they have almost nothing to do with free trade. That's obvious when you look at them. And they're, of course, being conducted in secret. because the general population is not supposed to know about such things. Actually, not completely in secret. They're not secret to the hundreds of corporate lawyers who are writing the detailed proposals. You can guess what they are. Now, some of them, in fact, have been leaked through WikiLeaks. The ones that were leaked were about what's called intellectual property rights. That's a euphemism for state-guaranteed monopoly pricing rights designed to ensure enormous profits for pharmaceutical corporations, other beneficiaries of taxpayer largesse, in what are laughably called free enterprise economies. Well, there are other examples, too numerous to mention, and not at all surprising. There's a recent study released by Princeton University by two leading political scientists, Martin Gilens, Benjamin Page. They carried out a careful study of a couple of thousand policy decisions, and the study reveals, I'll quote, that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The results provide substantial support for theories of economic elite domination, fancy term meaning the rich run the world, and for theories of what they call biased pluralism, not for theories of majoritarian electoral democracy or majoritarian pluralism. In other words, the United States doesn't remotely resemble a democracy. It's a plutocracy. There's nothing new about this. There's plenty of evidence about it. The same and other political scientists have shown quite effectively that the lower three-quarters, roughly, of the population, lower on the income scale, are essentially disenfranchised. The government pays absolutely no attention to their opinions. One of the reasons there's so little voting. It's kind of sensible. It's also been shown, mainly by political economist Thomas Ferguson, who's a major student of this, that campaign spending is a very good predictor of policy. Take a look at who's funding the campaigns, you can predict the policies. That goes back to the 19th century and right up to the present. And again, it's nothing new. About a century ago, there was a great campaign manager, Mark Hanna, the most famous in American history. He was asked, what are the most important things in a political campaign? And he said there are three. The first one is money. The second one is money. And I can't think of the third one. That was over 100 years ago. It's much more extreme today. But it's useful to have a new and very careful confirmation of what would be taught in elementary school in a free society that includes Europe. There's also ample evidence that security of state power and of concentrated private power, their security, is indeed a driving force in state policy. Security from enemies, primary among them the domestic population, which is always a potential dangerous threat to structures of power and domination. And furthermore, that's entirely natural. It's to be expected when we look at how policy is formulated. Not quite that simple. There are some interesting cases where these commitments conflict. No time to talk about them. But this is a very close approximation to reality and radically opposed to the standard doctrine. Well, let's turn to another question. What about security of the population? It's easy to demonstrate that that's a very marginal concern of state policy planners. So let me take two current examples of overwhelming significance, global warming and nuclear weapons. Any literate person is doubtless aware that these are both, or should be, that these are dire threats to the security of the population. So it's therefore interesting to turn to state policy. And we find that it is dedicated to accelerating the threats in both cases, in the interests of the primary concerns: enhancement of state power, concentrated private power that largely determines state policy. In the case of global warming, it is so obvious that I won't even go on to illustrate it. You should know it without comment. And it does illustrate very clearly the concern for security, certainly not for the population. It also illustrates the moral calculus of contemporary neoliberal state capitalism. The fate of our grandchildren counts as absolutely nothing in comparison with the need to make more profit tomorrow. That's the driving principle of what's called capitalism today. It's interesting to look at how the propaganda system works. In the United States, there's a huge public relations campaign. It's completely public, nothing secret about it, organized by the business world to try to convince the public that either global warming isn't happening at all, or if it is, it has nothing to do with human activity. And it's having some impact. If you take a look at international polls, the United States ranks somewhat lower than other countries in public concern about global warming. And indeed, the results are stratified. Among Republicans, the U.S. ranks far lower, practically as low as anywhere in the world. The Republicans are the party that is most totally dedicated, lockstep dedication to private power and its rights and privileges. The leading journal of media criticism in the United States is the Columbia Journalism Review, Columbia University. Its current issue has a very interesting article on this topic. It attributes this outcome to the media doctrine of what they call fair and balanced, which means that if a journal publishes, say, an opinion piece reflecting the conclusions of 97% of scientists, it has to run a counter piece presenting the claims of the energy corporations. Actually, that is what happens, and it does lead to confusion on the part of the population, but there certainly is no doctrine of fair and balanced. So suppose a journal runs one of the thousands of opinion pieces denouncing Putin for the criminal act of taking over Crimea. It certainly doesn't have to run a piece pointing out that while the act is no doubt criminal, Russia has a far stronger case than the U.S. does in holding on to southeastern Cuba, taken over a century ago at gunpoint. It includes Cuba's major port, rejecting the demand of Cuba ever since independence to turn it back. And the only justification for this is that it contributes to the 50-year program of terrorist war and economic strangulation of the country guilty of successful defiance of U.S. policy since 1823. And the same is true of quite a few other current cases. No need to run opinion pieces about that. The actual media doctrine of fair and balanced holds for one case, when the concerns of concentrated private power are involved, nowhere else. And though this is obvious enough, it cannot be perceived in the elite culture, in the educated culture. You can verify that very easily by checking. Well, let's turn to the threat of instant destruction by nuclear weapons. The record on that is extremely interesting, and it demonstrates quite clearly that from the earliest days, the security of the population has been a non-issue and remains so to the present. The record is shocking and insufficiently recognized. I'd really urge you to look at it closely. It strongly supports the lament of the General Lee Butler. He's the last commander of the Strategic Air Command, which controls nuclear weapons and weapons policy. In his words, we have so far survived the nuclear age by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in the greatest proportion. And he goes on to say that we can hardly count on divine intervention as we continue to play roulette with the fate of the species in pursuit of the driving factors in state policy. He didn't add that, I added it. So take a couple of illustrative examples, beginning at the start of the atomic age. At that time, this is 1950, the US was overwhelmingly powerful, enjoyed remarkable security, nothing like it in history, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had 50% of the world's wealth, is just incomparable power and security. There was, however, one potential threat, at that time. That was ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. They didn't exist, but they might exist someday. There is actually a standard scholarly review of nuclear policies, written with access to high-level documents. It's by McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And what he writes is that he describes the development of ICBMs with nuclear warheads as one of the great achievements of the Eisenhower administration, but he then adds that it's useful to recognize that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if these missiles had never been developed. And he adds a very instructive comment. He says, I am aware of no proposal, could find no proposal in the literature, either in or out of government, that these missiles should be banned by agreement. Nobody even considered it. There was no thought at all of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, threat of utter destruction, and this striking fact merits a phrase in the standard comprehensive history and has been ignored in commentary. I can't find anyone who's ever even referred to it. Well, could it have been prevented? Would a treaty have been possible? Can't be sure, of course, but there's some indication that it would have been possible. One suggestive indication is a remarkable proposal by Stalin in 1952. He offered to allow Germany to be unified with free elections, which of course the communists would lose, but with a condition that it not join a hostile military alliance. Again, hardly an extreme condition in the light of history. Well, Stalin's proposal was received in the United States, but it was ignored or, whenever mentioned, just ridiculed. Actually, recent scholarship, which now has access to Russian archives, has begun to take quite a different view, and an illuminating one. One case is Adam Ulam. He's a bitterly anti-communist Harvard scholar, leading specialist on Bolshevik Russia. Here's what he says. He says, the status of Stalin's proposal is an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the GDR on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and real security that would have been enormous? One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, reviewing recent research in Soviet archives, writes that scholars are surprised to discover that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions, and of course to improve political and economic conditions in Russia. Opportunities, he points out, that were squandered in favor of gaining West German participation in NATO. Well, under those circumstances, it's not at all impossible that agreements might have been reached that would have protected the security of the population from the gravest imaginable threat, total destruction. But the possibility was not considered. Another striking indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy. Incidentally, this tells us quite a lot about intellectuals in the United States and Europe. Try to find any discussion of this. Well, that was revealed again in the years that followed. A couple of years later, Nikita Khrushchev took office. He recognized right away that Russia could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest, most powerful country in history. And he recognized that if Russia hoped to escape from its economic backwardness and, of course, the devastating effects of the Second World War, it would be necessary to reverse the arms race. So he proposed sharp reductions in offensive weapons, mutual reductions. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it. Instead, they turned to rapid military expansion. The late Kenneth Waltz, one of the leading, most respected international relations scholars, describes it like this. He said, the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, as Khrushchev was trying to carry through a major reduction in conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we did so, the US did so, though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, a decision to harm national security, security of the population, while enhancing state power. That's Kennedy. A major reason why Kennedy barely squeaked to victory in 1960 was his charge that Eisenhower and Nixon had permitted the Russians to leap ahead in offensive weaponry, creating what they called a missile gap that severely threatened US security. That frightened the population enough so that Kennedy barely won the election. In reality, the US was far in the lead. The Russians had 4 operational ICBMs, tiny fraction of the US arsenal. And this was quickly understood. And speaking for the administration, McGeorge Bundy again, he explained that they had nevertheless been right in emphasizing a fake missile gap because, as he put it, the phrase had a useful shorthand effect of calling attention to our basic military posture. That's an allusion to the posture of rapidly expanding, overwhelming US dominance and threat, and rejecting security and the prospects for survival. Well, the Russians did react. The reaction was to place missiles in Cuba in October 1962. That move was motivated also by Kennedy's huge terrorist campaign against Cuba, which is mostly suppressed, but there's plenty of evidence about it, which was scheduled to lead to invasion in October 1962, the month when the missiles were emplaced. Now, that brought the world to the most dangerous moment in history, Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger's phrase, historian. As the crisis peaked in late October, Kennedy received a secret letter from Khrushchev offering to end the crisis by simultaneous public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These Jupiter missiles were obsolete missiles. The withdrawal order had already been given for them because they were being replaced by far more lethal, essentially invulnerable Polaris submarines. Kennedy's subjective estimate was that if he refused this offer, the probability of nuclear war was between 1/3 and 1/2, a war that would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, as President Eisenhower had stated. He refused. It's hard to think of a more horrendous decision in human history. And worse, he's praised for his cool courage and statesmanship. 10 years later, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert in the last days of the 1973 Israel-Arab War. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomatic maneuvers. These were designed to ensure an Israeli victory, but a limited victory, so that the U.S. would still be in control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were indeed delicate. The United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger secretly informed Israel that they could ignore it, and therefore he called a nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away. The security of the population had its usual status, 0. 10 years after that, the Reagan administration came in, and they decided to launch operations to probe Russian defenses. The way they did it was by simulating air and naval attacks against Russia, and also calling the highest level nuclear alert, which is of course known to the Russians. All of this was undertaken at a very tense moment. Pershing II missiles were being deployed in Europe. These had a 5-minute flight time to Moscow. Reagan announced the so-called Star Wars program, missile defense, which the Russians understood to be a first strike weapon. That's how missile defense is understood on all sides for good reasons. And other tensions were rising. Well, naturally, the Russians were quite alarmed by this. Unlike the United States, Russia is quite vulnerable, had repeatedly been invaded, almost destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. There are newly released archives that reveal that the danger was much more severe than historians had previously assumed. There's a CIA study that just appeared. It's called "The War Scare Was for Real." CIA concludes that the U.S. underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian reaction. The major journal on this topic, the Journal of Strategic Studies, writes that these Reagan exercises almost became a prelude to a preventive nuclear strike, which would have wiped out the Northern Hemisphere. And in fact, it was more dangerous than that. We learned last September, it was revealed that right in the midst of these world-threatening developments, Russia's automated early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, sending the highest level alert. Well, the protocol for the Soviet military, like the American military, is to retaliate at once with a nuclear attack of its own. Now, there was an officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov. He decided to disobey the orders and not to report the warning to his superiors. And thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're alive to talk about it. That was 1983. You can determine how much publicity has been given to all of this. Well, security for the population was no more a priority for the Reagan planners than for their predecessors, and that continues right to the present. In fact, pretty obvious when you take a look at what's going on in Ukraine. And plans for the future are even more frightening. Obama came into office with nice rhetoric about cutting back the arms race. In fact, he's exceeding his predecessor, George Bush, in expanding the nuclear weapons arsenal. The United States under Obama is now planning to spend more than $1 trillion on the nuclear arsenal in the next 30 years. And of course, the United States is not alone, though it's in the lead. So going back to General Butler, it's a near miracle that we've escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to rescue us from our folly. Well, we're all surely aware, just to conclude, that we now face the most ominous decisions in human history. There are lots of problems that should be addressed, but two of them are overwhelming in their significance: environmental destruction, nuclear war. For the first time in history, we face the prospects of destroying the possibility of decent existence, and not in the distant future. And for this reason alone, it's imperative to sweep away the ideological clouds, face honestly and realistically the question of how policy decisions are made and what we can do to alter them before it's too late. Thanks.